Greetings, everyone. This is Reverend Erica Whitaker. I'm bringing you a new podcast series with the BSK Flourish Studios. This podcast series is titled E3, Women in Ministry. E3 meaning equipping, empowering, and educating theological institutions and churches all around the world about the importance of women in ministry. We hope you enjoy this podcast. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Candace Smith, Womanist theologian, who's also teaching at the seminary. We are thrilled to have you joining us today for this podcast with the Flourish Studios. Dr. Candace Smith, who I'll refer to you as Candace throughout this podcast, can you tell us a little bit about who you are? Introduce yourself to the audience.
Well, first, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on and to kind of share a little bit of my story and my journey. I guess, to tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Louisville, Kentucky. So much of my life was spent there. Let's see. I come from a really big family. So a smaller immediate family, but a big family. And just my formative years were in the church growing up, played a big, big role in who I am. I'm a fourth generation Pentecostal. And then I moved to Miami for graduate school and then kind of have been bouncing around different places since then. So that's just a little bit about me.
Well, that's a pretty remarkable story. One, I'm not going to tell everybody your age, because I don't know it, but you are young. You're a young woman with a doctorate. And as somebody who's trying to finish her doctorate, I am envious. And you're an excellent academic. And I love that you have ties to Louisville as well. Louisville is one of the cities that the seminary is housed in. But it also sounds like a lot of your background has connected to this kind of calling as a theologian, as a teacher. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got into this work, why you stay in this work, particularly as a woman and a woman of color?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I will say I didn't initially want to be in this work. So starting out, I've known pretty much most of my life that I wanted to be an educator. I was really shaped by educators. Most of my family is in the medical profession. So a lot of nurses, some surgical nurses, a lot of people are in that field. And I was like, I want to steer clear from that. But most of my time growing up, I really did good in school. Like academics were my thing. It was my jam. So I was like, I wanted to be an educator. And I remember my mom would tell stories about how growing up, I would help my younger brother, like, I guess in our playtime, it was like playing teacher. So that's really kind of what I wanted to do. And I entered college, undergraduate degree, really looking to be a Spanish professor. So I had taken advanced Spanish classes, and so that's what I was going for. But I really didn't like the program. And so I switched to elementary education. And so that's where I felt like I was headed. Now, I did probably around 16, I felt like I had a call, like I experienced my call to ministry. And like I said, I wrestled a lot and I was like, God, I don't want to be a preacher. I'm a woman. In my tradition, it was just a little challenging, I guess, for some of the women. And I didn't want to do that. And I do, I guess, come from a long line of preachers as well. So it's kind of like nurses and preachers and pastors. But anyway, I prayed, I tried to fight it. And right before going to my master's program was when I just really had a come to Jesus moment, like the semester after I graduated. And after several weeks of discerning, I was like, okay, I'm going to quit fighting and I'll go to seminary. And I think that it was just really important for me to make that decision to go to be trained, because I wanted to do it well, you know? And so I went to seminary, and early in seminary, some of my professors was like, you really should consider a doctoral program. And I was like, I don't want to do that. And so I ended up doing chaplaincy for a while. I did a residency as a chaplain, and I really liked that. I felt like that was a really good space of kind of bringing together marketplace type ministry, and conversational ministry. And during that time, like, I know some of our students, or most of our students at BSK, do some form of chaplaincy, right? So you all know it's a lot of discerning and like having those hard questions and the times of reflection with your supervisors. And so I just kind of started to really think and like walk through, okay, God, what are you asking for me? And once again, I kind of felt that call to go back to education. And so completed that process, and that's what I did. So, and it's been good.
And
I've
by
been
process,
teaching.
you've been teaching, but by process. So you did a residency, which was like 4 units of CPE, right? On top of your master's degree, right? Your master's of divinity. So as somebody who has 5 units of CPE, it is, people are like, oh, you just go sit and talk to people who are like dying. I'm like, oh no, this is like soul work on top of academic work, on top of learning how to work with other people amidst a whole lot of diversity. So you have CPE, you have your master, and then you go off and you do a PhD.
Yeah.
So like you kind of shrug it all under the rug, like, oh, I did all this education and now I teach. I'm like, oh no, girl, you've been working hard.
Yeah. And I guess I don't know. I do that a lot, I think, because school is kind of, like I said, just one of the things that I love learning. And so it's kind of like second nature, but it was an intense journey. And even to your point about chaplaincy, that was like one of the most formative years, I would say, of my adult life, because I was at a level 1 trauma hospital. So it was a lot coming at you. I split time between the ER, which is super fast paced, and then throughout the hospital, but working on the palliative care team. It was really, really, really life-giving, yet challenging. So
Where did you do your residency?
The University of Louisville Hospital.
Okay. Oh yeah. So you were like, I didn't mind downtown Dallas at Methodist Dallas. So when you said like level trauma 1, you're like, oh yeah. Like I totally know what you mean by like ER and 2 a.m. and you know, a few crazy people coming in and out.
Yeah. It was a lot. It was a lot, but it was one of the best years of my life. To really, I feel like seminary, a lot of times it prepares you, because of course by the time I had did chaplaincy work, I did it post graduation, and I had already served in my field placement as a pastor intern. So like I had that piece of working in the church, but it was a smaller church. And so we didn't have a lot of, I don't think we had any funerals the entire time that I was there. And again, as a smaller church, there were different nuances. And I feel like seminary prepared me for the academic side a lot, and maybe some of the pastoral stuff, but I definitely feel like chaplaincy took it up a notch. It was like, okay, this is baptism by fire now. So get in there.
and you're going to fail, and then you're going to think about why you failed, and then you'll be okay. It'll be okay. Yeah. So you did that, and now you're teaching in a seminary, and I think your really kind of gracious critique on seminary is my experience too. Like, it's a wonderful learning hub. But you have to get in the mess and the muck of the ministry world and to see yourself in the mirror, your worst self and your best self. What I love about the seminary is that really they do provide a hands-on learning experience, and chaplaincy. Anastasia Holman is incredible. She's out of Indianapolis. She's part of the seminary family too. I'm so glad you're on board and you get to interact and you get to teach. And your specialty, in my understanding, is womanist theology, correct?
Well, yes, and practical theology.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sorry, say that one more time. I was freezing up just a little bit.
Yeah, it cut out. I said womanist theology and practical theology.
And I think both of those come hand in hand. And by practical theology, based upon your experience in the chaplaincy, but as a womanist theologian too, that is in the mess, in the muck of theology, and really turning things upside down, flipping them around. Theology that is often rooted in white theology, patriarchal theology, is really being reshaped by womanist theologians like you. So I'm curious about your experience teaching at a seminary, bringing your gifts, your practical theology, your womanist studies. What has that been like?
So it's been it's been a good experience. So previously, before coming to BSK, I was at a small Catholic, well, I guess a mid-sized Catholic institution in South Florida. So definitely there's different contexts. But one of the things that I really love about BSK has been the commitment to social justice. And I think this has been a very life-giving time for me where I'm really able to drill down and really refine some of the things that I would like to add to the field of both practical theology and womanist theology. So with that commitment, I see definitely not just in teaching the Black and Womanist theology course, but even in talking with other colleagues, hearing the different texts that are being used from womanist theologians has been great. Because even a lot of my formative education, it wasn't until my doctoral program when I decided to specialize in womanist theology did I really get to read extensively. Like a lot of I guess our curriculum was very much so European. I guess, yeah, European. I want to re-say this because I want to say it.
Go ahead.
Let me think of how I want to say it in a nice
way.
You
don't have to be nice either. It's okay.
I'm still learning. Just can we not include this piece? Yeah. This will just be me talking. Fine. I'm still
I got it.
Learning my way in this environment, trying to create safe spaces. So that's why I guess I'm trying to be nice. But okay, back to what I was saying. A lot of,
that's totally fine.
A lot of the readings that we had were really steeped in white patriarchy. So it's been refreshing to see now and to be at an institution or part of an institution where we really can ask the hard questions, where we can have the tough conversations, really in a safer spaces and extending grace towards one another to say, hey, like, we're learning, we're all trying to work this out, and it's tough conversations, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. I teach preaching, and I teach preaching as a white woman who grew up in all white spaces, very conservative, and went to a seminary that was rooted in white patriarchy and the curriculum. So I bring that along with my own hard work along the way, teaching African American men, African American women, women in general. Yeah, so it's a big learning curve. And that's the beauty of teaching, and maybe you have found this too, is that it's this mutual reciprocal exchange of what the Holy Spirit is doing in the life of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And that has been humbling, but also empowering for me. And this podcast is all about empowering and equipping and then educating people, specifically on women. And I'm so grateful that we have women of color, African American women, who are willing to step into spaces that are predominantly white or have its roots in whiteness and patriarchy, even if those spaces are trying to find some redemption, some resurrection in a different degree. So I am curious, and I do think it'd be helpful for our audience, who will both be male and female, non-gender, non-binary, LGBTQ, but also white and Black and people of color. What has been your experience as a woman kind of entering into academics, which is still very male dominated, and then a woman of color who's been entering into white spaces probably time and time again? If you could share some challenges, some experiences, or maybe just a story, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good question. It's been challenging. So I'm not as young as I look. I guess I would be considered middle-aged. But it's been hard because I think both my gender and my age, a lot. And I think not only in the academy, but also in ministry in general. And I kind of knew that this was gonna be a challenge because growing up, when I finally accepted my call and embraced it, talking to my pastor, I was one of the youngest ministers at my church. And I also had another strike against me because outside of the pastor, I was the only minister who chose to go get formal theological education. So that was pretty tough. And growing up, I guess in the Afro-Pentecostal tradition, like in my context, there was a suspicion of theological education, formal theological education. So I would always hear stories about, oh, you're going to cemetery. And I mean, it was just not very, I guess, life-giving, but so I feel like that in some ways prepared me for entering these spaces. And in the context of theological education or like academia, I feel like there's oftentimes two like debates that it's either bring your Blackness into the room or bring your gender. And it wasn't really a space to bring both and that's why I examined what I did, the topic that I did for my dissertation, and I was looking at the experiences of Pentecostal Black women in formal theological education, and really was looking at how can we revamp the theological education system that we educate the whole person, so that we don't force people to choose one part of their identity over the other. And then also I feel like theological education there has been somewhat, I guess, as you go kind of further up, I felt also the challenge of kind of losing my ministerial identity or my strong connection with the church, and I guess the academic side researching. And funny enough, I was reading a book by Elizabeth Condi Frazier. She was talking about the contributions of the Latinx community to theological education, and she was saying that she kind of experienced some of the same. And like, I guess in the early parts of her career, different mentors were talking to her to say, hey, like you can't stand in between the church and the academy. Like you basically kind of have to choose one. But I think that that's partly why I chose practical theology, to be able to speak to all of the publics, to speak to the church, the academy, and to society. Because I think that you can do it. And I think that theological education will be enriched, the church will be enriched, and society will be enriched if we're able to like face those challenges head on and live authentically. So
that was so well said. How do we face those challenges head on and live authentically? And it is really challenging when you do enter into spaces and you have to consciously decide what part you have to bring and what part has to take a back seat in order to be heard or to function. That happens in the church all the time. That happens in higher education, institutions. And so how do we create a pathway that was blazed by incredible women and a few men too, years ago, but we're kind of paving it now. And that's really challenging. And that's why I think it's so important to lift up voices like your own, to empower, to equip, and then to educate. As we kind of wrap up this podcast, I wonder what wisdom or advice or encouragement would you give to both churches and to institutions of higher education, from your own perspective and your own kind of lived experience?
So this is chapter 5 of my dissertation. So one, I would say that there has to be opportunities for really support. So for theological institutions and just higher education in general, it has to be more than just we have students of color, we have faculty of color, but really breaking down some of the barriers of access. So like for me, that's one of the reasons why I choose to continue to teach, is I see the difference that it makes when I show up in a classroom and other Black women see me, and other students of color as well. But being able to help the same way that I had the people, the professors, even some of the department support staff helped me through my journey, praying with me, telling me about conferences. One of my best memories of my doctoral program was when I was meeting with one of my professors, because you kind of come in and they expect you to do all of these things, and I'm like, well, I wasn't doing this in undergrad or in graduate school. And she kind of sat down with me and she went through a call for papers, and she was like, here is how you unpack it. Here is how you write your abstract to submit a proposal to speak. And I still have that paper, just as a reminder that like, just like somebody helped me, I have to help the next person coming through. So just having the support, academic support, but also non-academic support, like people coming to higher education institutions, they bring their life outside of the classroom with them. So having mental health support, having just health and wellness things are things that I really think that higher education has to begin to really invest in. Creating trauma-informed classrooms, like training professors to have those safe spaces to be able to unpack equipping both professors and students with, those skill sets. And with churches, I really think supporting the groups that are underrepresented, represented. So having scholarships, really just making a space. Like, I used to say, I felt like that there was not a lot of space for me in the church. And sometimes it felt like there was not space for me in the academy. And I think it was primarily because I graduated like at the height of the pandemic. So right when the pandemic happened, I graduated, and then higher ed went on like a hiring freeze across the board. And so it was just really like I worked and put all of this time in, and then nobody was hiring. And then after that, like when they started hiring, you had graduates from like 2 to 3 years. So the market was oversaturated. And it was just a really challenging time. And I was like, God, like, and when I say not hiring, I'm talking about outside of like adjunct work.
Yeah.
And so it was just really, really a challenging time. And I'm like, okay, God, there's no space for me. And I didn't feel like I could fit in anywhere. But I'm realizing sometimes you got to create the space and make if there's not a space for you at the table, build your own table, like the saying goes. And so that's kind of what I had to do. And so, so for theological institutions and for churches, that's my advice. And also to people who are pursuing higher education, I think that last comment about making a space for yourself, I'd leave that with the group, that nobody can be you better than you can be you. And there are unique gifts, skill sets, talents that you have. And one of the best things that my dissertation chair ever said was, Candace, this degree is meant to, you can use it as an entrepreneurial degree as well. And leverage, like, don't just fit into one small box of, I want to be a tenure track professor. Look at nonprofits, look at even going into business for yourself. How can you leverage these skills and speak to all three publics, So I'd leave that with students as well.
Thank you so much. One, you've provided a rich knowing, and that knowing comes from a deep place within who you are and who God created you to be, but also who you courageously continue to live out. And that's what I've taken from our time together, is the courage and the fortitude of making space, building tables for the people you want to see sit around. I'm grateful for theologians like you, for women like you. I'm grateful that you're part of our seminary family, as unique and unusual as it is. We are grateful that you are part of it. Thank you so much for your vulnerability and your willing to share space with me, and to share words of encouragement for our audience. Are there any other final things you'd like to say before we wrap up?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure having this conversation.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, I hope you will take a moment to make a contribution so that we can continue to make excellent content like this podcast and so many others that we have planned. You can do so by going to bsk.edu and click on the Give button. Thank you so much for your support.